several weeks ago, there was two separate, I guess, treaties signed. The first was in Pretoria, South Africa. The second in Nairobi. The first, if my understanding is correct, was a cessation of hostilities, and the second was essentially a way of making that permanent and a deal, political concessions by the Tigrayans in exchange for ostensibly for aid to come in and keep people from dying of starvation. Give us your assessment of both those agreements and what has taken place in the wake of the signing of those agreements.
Well, the immediate background to this is that at the end of August, there was this enormous new offensive was mounted by the combined armies of Ethiopia and Eritrea with many, many militia as well. And the Tigrayans, who were in defensive positions, were inflicting enormous casualties. And they assumed that the level of casualties that they were inflicting, especially on the non-commissioned officers and the junior officers, was such that the Ethiopians would give up after a few weeks. Didn't happen. 70 days of non-stop fighting and attacks. And the level of fatalities is quite extraordinary. The Ethiopian Chief of Staff himself admitted that his army, his regular army, had lost 136,000 dead in those 10 weeks of fighting. The fatalities among the militia are probably higher. The fatalities among the Eritreans probably almost as high. So that is a level of death and destruction actually at the battlefront that I don't think we've seen since World War II. And just dwell on those figures. Probably 350,000 dead on one side in a matter of weeks is quite horrifying. And what the Tigrayans basically discovered, they were suffering too, but much lower numbers because they were in defensive positions, was that the Prime Minister Abiy and President Isaias were ready to continue losing hundreds of thousands of young people at the front in order to prevail in this war. And the arithmetic just didn't add up for the defenders. They just had to recognize either they would be completely wiped out or they would have to sue for peace. So at the first opportunity, in fact, the only opportunity, which was the African Union summoned them for peace talks, on the assumption, actually, the African Union assumed that they would have surrendered by then. They would have been defeated. But as it happened, they weren't defeated. But they went and they said, okay, we will sue for peace. We will accept very adverse political terms in order to stop the fighting, in order to stop this extraordinary level of destruction and loss of life. And so that agreement was signed in Pretoria on November the 2nd after 8 days of talks. It's not a good agreement. It's a hastily patched together agreement. And essentially it is, as you say, a deal in which the Tigrayans concede their main political demands. They will dismantle their political party and their regional government in return for getting aid and having a ceasefire. And then the details of the ceasefire were then worked out in a subsequent round of negotiations in Nairobi the following week. And the basic deal there is that the Tigrayans will disarm, but only when the Eritreans have withdrawn. Now, what we have seen over the month or so since the signing of these two agreements is not much. There is certainly the fighting has stopped, and that's good. Some aid has come in, some services have been restored. That's good. But banks aren't functioning, telephone isn't functioning, hospitals really are still not running, and the Eritreans are still there, and they're still actually killing and looting. And meanwhile, in other parts of Ethiopia, especially in Oromia, the war is intensifying. So the forces that were fighting in Tigray have been relocated to a new front. The drones that were flying over Tigray and on a daily basis 2 months ago are now attacking sites in other parts of Ethiopia. So if a cessation of fighting in Tigray just means an intensification of fighting elsewhere in Ethiopia, this is not good news.
How does a regime, I'm talking about the Eritrean and the Ethiopian Ahmed regime, how does it sustain losses like that? Tens of thousands of like domestically, is there no pressure? I guess it's a two-parter. A, is there no pressure domestically? I mean, I guess if you're living in a totalitarian state, there isn't necessarily a huge opportunity for it. And there's no reason to believe that there's necessarily any better information traveling domestically than there is internationally, I guess, at this point. But also, I would add, as a second part of that question, if Ahmed starts to attack the Orama, is there not opportunity for some type of like united front from the Tigrayans, or they basically just need to, make sure that they don't have continued widespread starvation?
So there are two very good questions, and actually every time I speak to an Ethiopian, I ask the first question. I say, what are people in Ethiopia saying about this level of losses? How is it that it is still possible, after losing, several 100,000 young men and young women at the front line, that still there are tens of thousands of young people being trained and sent into this meat grinder? And the answer I get is they don't know what's going on. The information control is so complete that these young people who go to training camps think that they are just going to go for a walkover, or they're going to do peacekeeping or policing duties in areas where normality has returned. And there's stories of young. There was one story I was hearing, a young woman who was captured by the Tigrayans, and she hadn't even understood that she was actually in a battle. Her whole force had surrendered without really firing a shot because they didn't know how to use their weapons. And she was just asking for her cell phone. She said, "Oh, I've lost my cell phone. Who are you? Where? What's going on? How can I call my mother?" And we hear about Vladimir Putin, recruiting these people and sending them into Ukraine and just telling them it'll be a walk in the park. And I think something similar has been happening in Ethiopia.
Well,
but Abby, in response to your second question,
let me just, I'm sorry, forgive me, but let me just, because, like I say, I was there 25 years ago, and I don't know that I had ever seen that level of poverty. Frankly, I'm not that well traveled, but I had traveled a little bit up to that point. And is there widespread use of cell phones? Is there any type of like social media there? I mean, just, how is that type of, to lose hundreds of thousands of people, right, who are presumably your neighbors. I mean, there's, 100 million people. It's a big country. But you would need a tremendous amount of control, or a complete absence of any type of like mechanism in which for people to talk.
It is quite extraordinary that it has been maintained like this for so long, and indeed in quite a lot of areas where there have been where communities have lost a lot, there is definitely a demand for this has to end. But but it is also quite bizarre, and I don't really have a proper explanation for it, I have to say, for why it is possible for so many people to be willingly mobilized, because some of them are forced, there's no question, but many of them are just willingly join the army. And perhaps it is simply because so many of them are so poor, there's so little employment. The economy, which was until very recently growing very fast, it was one of the fastest growing economies in the world. Now it's one of the fastest contracting economies. So young people are desperate for any sort of employment. But surely, for sure, there's going to be a huge backlash and price to pay, and a social trauma arising from this.
Is it fair to kind of say that because of that kind of contraction in the economy, that the more nationalist rhetoric is more appealing?
I think the nationalist rhetoric actually was. It began when the economy was still expanding fast, and it was I think part of the problem was that the economy was visibly expanding, and these beautiful buildings were being built in the major cities, but there were still a lot of young people who felt we're not part of this, we're not actually getting the jobs that we want. And now, and then as it turns into a downward spiral with people being unable to afford the basics because of rampant inflation and factories closing and thousands of people being displaced from their farms and so on, then the search for culprits, for scapegoats, then becomes very intense.